My name is Juliana Mendoza, and I am here to affirm the side that we shouldn't enact a voter ID. This is a policy debate, and the word I'll define is voter ID law, and it's defined as a law requiring a voter to provide proof of his or her identity as a registered voter before casting a ballot. Now, I have many reasons to why we should enact voter ID, and my first example is from the article 18 Pros and Cons of Enacting Voter ID of Laws. They mention how, firstly, it protects the value of votes for everyone to cast a ballot legally. So, in other words, that we won't do any fraud. We won't have anybody come in and fill out a form more than once, and it will be a fair vote. Another example is going to be include several identified features for accuracy, meaning when someone applies for voter ID, it can provide several different identifying features for the individual that can provide them with a variety of benefits. The most common options include with the document is a photograph, but I also include a signature, fingerprints, and personal information that provides poll workers with a greater assurance that the individual has the right to vote. And I understand how not everybody can be able to get a photo ID, which is why another way we would be able to solve that problem is to have it make it easier. So in another article, if we're going to have voter ID laws, here's how to make them easy. It mentions other examples from other places that are already trying this method. One method is that without the ID, what we can do is we can have them take a picture and then they'll sign in, they'll swear off by that. And then that's one way to enact the voter ID, even if you're not able to take the time to go get your ID. Another way that we can enact voter ID for those who aren't able to actually go get an ID is to use your smartphone. Of course, not everyone can have this, but those who do have it can also use them. High-resolution camera phones are increasingly cheap. A simple app can use existing iPhone and Android systems to let poll workers take a picture and create an ID for any voter. It's just they said that it mentioned that it was only $10 worth, so it's not too expensive and anybody can join in. As to where another example is another example to why we should enact voter ID is it'll prevent fraud. It'll protect all votes and fraud, so no one can just like go and get your information. All you need is your photo ID. You don't need much information about yourself, so people can't access your information. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Yes. So
Is that all?
yes. That's my
Yeah,
view.
no, you're good. So one of the questions I have is, do you think needing fingerprints and birth certificates just to vote is like really needed, or do you think you should just be able to vote?
It's not a requirement, but it is necessary to enact the voter ID because that is the goal. We are trying to make it easier. If you already have your photo ID, then you're already set, you're perfect, you're fine. But that was just another method for those who aren't able to get their ID on time, or if they don't have one and they don't have access to getting one, it was just an easier method for them to take.
Okay. And then my other question would be, do you think like using technology to track people and stuff like that can make fraud become more likely, or do you think it just helps out the situation more to like prevent fraud? Do you think it makes fraud more likely, or do you think it prevents it with the technology?
I believe it would prevent it just because in a lot of examples of that I researched is had just the photo ID and then it would have their signature or their fingerprints. Is not asking about so much information. And that is why, like, when you apply for your photo ID, you already give your information. So this is just another set. You would just show your photo and you don't have to fill out as much information as you do for all of the ballots.
All right, sweet. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Trujillo, and I'm speaking on the negative side as to why voter ID laws should not exist. Do you ever feel like you are being held back and shunned away, kind of like you're left in the shadows? Well, that's what voter ID laws are doing to some Americans. See, in an article by the ACLU, it states voter identification laws are a part of an ongoing strategy to roll back decades of progress on voting rights. It then goes on to say voter ID laws deprive many voters of their right to vote, reduce participation, and stand in direct opposition to our country's trend of including more Americans in the democratic process. Many Americans do not have one of the forms of identification states acceptable for voting. These voters are disproportionately low income racial and ethnic minorities, the elderly, and people with disabilities. Such voters more frequently have difficulty obtaining ID because they cannot afford or cannot obtain the underlying documents that are a prerequisite to obtaining government issued photo ID cards. So, should this be okay to shut people out who don't have money to afford IDs? I mean, they live in America, and we in this system that we are in say that America, everyone living in America has a voice, and we all have one. But that's not true, then, right? Because again, if we are shutting certain groups out, isn't that discriminatory? Then the answer is yes. I mean, voter fraud is so rare to find nowadays that how can you honestly continue to bank on the fact that every election that doesn't go one party's way, that it was rigged or frauded in some way? Root from the intel.com states why this is true when she says, besides disproportionately harming historically unprecedented groups, voter IDs are redundant and have been repeatedly proven unnecessary. For instance, voters are already required to attest to their identity and eligibility when they vote. Moreover, death by lightning strike is more common than occurrences of an in-person voter impersonation. The only kind of fraud voter IDs purport to prevent, it's control. That's what politicians want, and that's why such laws are starting to take place in so many states. Root later says, despite claims by voter ID proponents, the goal of these laws is not to protect the integrity of our elections, but rather to tip elections in their favor. By making it harder for certain groups to vote, conservative lawmakers who promote voter IDs can insulate themselves from accountability and maintain political control. This is once again all true. All politicians want is power and control over all. They will never back down from those. If we continue to keep believing the system is in our favor, we are all doomed. The government and politicians don't care about us. We are just a pawn in their chess game. They will sacrifice all of us before revealing what's behind the red curtain. Stop being content with laws restricting us from our own rights. Fraud is so rare that these politicians just use it as an excuse. Part of the Insider article by Grace Panetta explains the fact behind voter fraud. She says Heritage's database identified 131 criminal convictions, civil penalties, diversions, or other official findings for fraudulent use of mail ballots between 2000 and 2020, a time period during which approximately 250 million ballots were cast. As MIT election scholar Charles Stewart and National Vote at Home Institute CEO Amber McReynolds noted in an April opted that puts the rate of mail-in ballots resulting in criminal convictions at 0.0006% and the rate of mail ballots resulting in any kind of official action at 0.0007%. Another example of almost non-existent fraud in ballots is from Andy Sullivan from Reuters, as he says, like other forms of voter fraud, double voting appears to be exceptionally rare, according to multiple studies. Election officials rejected 8,247 absentee ballots in the 2016 presidential election because the voter had also cast a ballot in person, according to figures collected by the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. Although the vast majority appear not to have been intentional attempts at fraud. All states have measures in place to prevent voters from casting two ballots, experts say. Things are put in place for a reason. States are prepared for this kind of inaccuracy, so they correct it by being on top. Actually, in the same article, it states, with modern technology, we know within 6 seconds our databases are updated, said Mark Early, supervisor of elections in Leon County, Florida. Early said his office saw a handful of attempted double votes each election, usually from elderly voters who had forgotten they cast mail ballots. See people, whether they are forgetting or trying to sneak past like the 0.0007% of people, are being caught within seconds. Voter fraud is non existent.
All right. So, okay, so you mentioned how it does like deprive people from feeling that they can't vote because they can't afford to afford the IDs, or they just can't have access to it. Why wouldn't it be a good idea for us to why wouldn't it be okay for us to do the method of having them take a picture and then have a signature? It would be just the same and just as easy.
I just feel like for some, as I explained, like some of the lower income families, sometimes they like they don't have access to like technology, or even some of the people here in the U.S. don't really have license and stuff like that. I mean, they're working hard here in America and stuff like that, but they don't have the essentials that are required in certain states to vote. And I just think that the more they up the requirements, the more people they're just going to push away from the vote. And I feel like that's what the politicians ultimately want, is not like protection, but more of like trying to push like the lower income like families out of the vote so they can get like the middle class and upper class to vote.
Okay, and with modern technology, wouldn't it be the same as to where we just ask for a picture and we put it in the system, and for someone else to put it in, and then like you mentioned in your last examples how it was able to detect it? Wouldn't it be about the same as using a photo ID? It would just be a lot easier, and it would be like 100% sure that it would be no fraud out there, and double voting would be a lot faster and easier.
Yeah, that's true. I think like with the modern technology, like with it finding within seconds, just like a photo ID, if you were able to snap it on the side and be like, oh, okay, this person is who they say they are, let's go ahead and have them vote. And then that way that prevents, I agree with that. But I just think again, like because we can find it, like because we can find fraud so easily with voting, and like how minimal it is, I just think that it's just non-existent, and there's no need to like hold certain like groups back from being able to vote who don't have that money, whether it's like with technology that they need to show like a photo ID or a birth certificate or fingerprints or anything like that. I just think that it holds people back more than it does help out the United States when in terms of like the election process.
Okay. So going back to the affirmative side, um, I going back to what my opponent has mentioned about how it leaves out those who can't afford, or like lower classes. However, I did mention as my last example how we will make it easier for those who aren't able to get access to either internet or the photo IDs. So what our kind of plan was to have either a smartphone. If they can't have that, then we'll take a picture of them and then we'll just have them sign, or even just their fingerprints. That was mentioned in the article. If we're going to have a photo ID laws, here's how to make them easy. And that was one method that we were able to use for those who aren't even able to, that don't have like iPhones or enough money to purchase the photo ID. That was another method that we were able to take, another step for those who are deprived of that feeling of being able to vote because they don't have enough money. And going back to my first example of how it's for better accuracy as well, even though the system does find it, like he said, there are cases of where like they have like accidentally forgot that they voted twice, so they try to do it again. But this way, the photo ID would be a lot faster and a lot easier for the systems to go through, and it'd be less hassle work for paperwork as well, because you would have to submit all the information again just to let you know that, hey, they already did it more than once, like, we have to stop this vote from going through. It would just be a lot easier, faster, simpler for both parties, for those voting and this administration. And like I said before, for the fraud, it is just to say, like, information. Every time you open up a ballot or anything like that, you have to write down all your information, and that opens up for hackers to go through the system. And it's just like as technology is improving here and there, it is just a lot safer and more easier to access that way as well.
All right. Is voter suppression the real goal? Do they really want to eliminate certain minority groups for just for one party to win over the other? Is that really how long or how low politicians have gone? The short and simple answer is yes. This may be surprising given some of the reports about voter ID requirements in the past few years. A 2012 analysis, for example, found that as many as 758,000 registered voters in Pennsylvania didn't have a photo ID issued by the state transportation department, suggesting that up to 9.2% of Pennsylvania voters may have been disenfranchised by a district photo ID law. This comes from Vox.com by German Lopez. I mean, come on, 9.2% pushed away from voting. That is easily enough to swing a state one side to the next. That's the real problem. It's not fraud, but it's limiting those who can vote so these politicians get what they want. Later in the same article, Lopez states a 2012 investigation by the News 21 Journalism Project looked at all kinds of voter fraud nationwide, including voter impersonation, people voting twice, vote buying, absentee fraud, and voter intimidation. It confirmed that voter impersonation was extremely rare with just 10 credible cases, but the other types of fraud weren't common either. In total, the project uncovered 2,068 alleged election fraud cases from 2000 through part of 2012, covering a time span when more than 620 million votes were cast in national general elections alone. That represents about 0.00003 alleged cases of fraud for every vote cast, and 344 fraud cases per national general election, in each of which between 80 million and 135 million people voted. The number of fraudulent voters was a drop in the bucket. See, it's a little to nothing. It's just something politicians want you to believe that is there, but in reality, it's not. I mean, do you really need to show your ID just to vote if you can just state your name and that would make things easier? If evidence shows it's rare, why does it exist? A perfect example to go with is from the web article by Izzy Lepowski on Wired. She writes, working with the Department of Justice, the researchers set out to determine whether they could match voters on the voter roll with their corresponding records in the ID database. Using just a few basic details to do that, they developed an algorithm that scanned the state of Texas voters' rolls and compared it to the federal list of driver's license, state IDs, and concealed handgun permits, among other forms of acceptable identification. It scanned each record by address, date of birth, gender, and name to see if, for instance, a combination of addresses, gender, and name would be as accurate as a predictor as a combination of date of birth, gender, and name. To check their results, the researchers relied on a subset of the voter data that contained social security numbers. Those records effectively served as the algorithm's answer key. They ultimately found that 98% of the records that could be matched using social security numbers could also be matched using any three of the four key identifiers: address, date of birth, gender, and name. So if fraud is out the door, then it's exactly what I stated earlier, voter suppression. I mean, even Lopez writes, so the problem that voter ID laws set out to fix isn't really a problem that needs solving. But maybe the goal of these kind of laws isn't to combat voter fraud, but to suppress certain voters. As the New York Times reported, some Republicans have openly acknowledged that hurting Democrat voters is their goal. Like what? How is that okay to continue if that's a side's sole purpose? They are using an excuse they call fraud to hurt votes from another side just to get a win. This is totally wrong and needs to be stopped. I urge those listening to understand that we do not need a voter ID law. It's clear through research that there is no significant evidence in which any sort of fraud impacts an election or state swinging one side from the next. Politicians are trying to manipulate the people and make us think that voter fraud exists, but they have been exposed. Like the New York Times said, some Republicans openly admitted to wanting to hurt voters for Democrats. this is all just a game and we can decide to stand up or just keep playing along. It is time to voice out and take a stand.
Although my opponent has made very valid and good points, however, I do stick with the femicide that we should enact voter IDs when it comes to any kind of ballot or votes. It would not only be a lot easier, but it's a lot faster. And just with the swipe of a photo ID, a vote will go through and it would make everybody's lives a lot easier. Now, even though it is harder for those who don't have access to it, once again, we do have a counter plan to help out those by just taking a picture and we'll do the process for them. Or they can just buy any phone and it was just a $10 app that anyone has access to and is open to everyone, no matter what class they are in. And it is also a great way to prevent the fraud as well as to reducing the chances of the multiple votes going on. Thank you.